I always found really, really crazy people interesting. I think most people do. But there's two types of interest in craziness. There's the kind that makes you want to go, oh my God, that's fascinating, but keep it away from me. Or it's the kind that's very fascinating and I want to get close to it. And I was one of those people. But I think it was partly because I was reassuring that there were people who were even worse off than I was. And that's interesting. That's why I think in my early years working in that hospital, I found it quite easy to get close to people who were very, very crazy because they didn't seem so different to me. I'd had some of the experiences they'd had. I'd certainly thought a lot about killing myself, so that didn't seem a strange idea to me. And I think that's part of the problem. Some professionals trying to work with these people get very scared very quickly. I think that's very strange. And I want to stop that person doing that. And they get very anxious. So a lot of our use of medication, I think, is calming the professional down. It's giving the professional, treating their anxiety. Because this other person's experience is very frightening to them. And I've never, for whatever reason, I've never just been that frightened by it. It just seems more interesting than scary. Most of the time. Not all the time. Madness is a word we use in every culture to describe people who are having experiences that most of us don't have. That are like hearing voices that other people can't hear, like having very strong but unusual beliefs, often quite scary beliefs. There's always been in every culture throughout history some people who are different and who have experiences that other people don't have. At times in history, these people have been revered as mystics, people who, the pharaohs used to employ people who heard voices to help them interpret their dreams. But now in Western society we say they've got some brain disease and they should be drugged up all their lives or locked away or whatever. So, yeah, I think everybody, we all pretty much agree on what madness is. It's being different in having experiences that are sometimes so different that they're scary, either to the person who's having them or to somebody else. What we don't agree on, all of us, is what causes that. We all have different guesses about what causes that. So one of the ways that there are different explanations of these experiences, of course, are different cultures. Because we've been talking mostly about Western, the arguments within Western society about whether it's biological or social. Of course, there's other cultures with entirely different explanations. Like where I come from in New Zealand, Maori people see it as hearing voices as largely a spiritual experience. They often understand voices as messages from ancestors, for instance, guiding them, sometimes telling them off. It's not always good. Sometimes they get a message from grandfather who's a bit cross with them. But they see it largely in a spiritual context, and they don't see it as at all strange. So one of my PhD students, who's Maori, did her PhD on asking Maori people how they understand what she called extraordinary experiences. She didn't want to call it schizophrenia, like hearing voices. And I asked her to ask them what they thought caused it. And she didn't want to do that. But I insisted, and she came back 2 years later after doing all these interviews with a big smile on her face. And she said, "John, they didn't understand the question. I said, what do you mean? She said, asking me what causes me to hear voices is like asking me why I get up in the morning. It's like asking me why I say hello to my mother in the morning, asking me why the sun comes up. It just happens, and it happens a lot, and it's not unusual. So I don't understand this question about what causes it. I would be more surprised if I didn't hear voices. So we have to remember that in some cultures, it's a spiritual experience, and it's just not seen as scary or odd at all. It's interesting to note that surveys around the world show that roughly, on average, 15%, I'm talking about Western cultures now, 15% of people hear voices at some point in their lives. In terms of the way that people who have these experiences understand their experiences, that's a big part of what we write about in the book Making Sense of Madness, because there's 10 or more stories in there about the different ways that people understand their own psychosis. And what's interesting is that there's so many different explanations. Yeah, some people think it is biological, not many, but one or two did. Most of them have some sort of psychosocial type of explanation, either trauma or abuse or stress of one kind or another. Some have a spiritual perspective on it and struggle, my psychiatrist says I'm mad, but I think I'm having a spiritual experience. What's the truth? How do I figure that out? And that's really the point of the book, that there is no one truth about this thing called schizophrenia, that it's many, many different things to different people. And what's most important is not what we professionals think it is, but what the person sitting in the other chair thinks it is, because it's their experience. Madness is a word that everybody understands, in any country, in any language. It's a word that ordinary people use to describe having very strange experiences or hearing voices or having very odd beliefs. But the term schizophrenia has a lot of problems with it. First of all, it sounds like it's a medical illness, and it isn't. It's not a scientific word, because no one over the 100 years that we've been using this word, we've never been able to agree a definition of it. So you get people with completely different symptoms being diagnosed schizophrenic. So there's very little science behind it. So every time we use the word schizophrenia, we are being unscientific. But more importantly than that, it's just a very stigmatizing word, because it's become attached to this idea that people have something wrong with their brains or their genes. There's something basically defective about them, in that they're permanently defective. And that's an awful thing to tell somebody when they're struggling with difficult experiences. But why psychiatry allows itself to be controlled by the pharmaceutical industry when it is supposed to be a scientific discipline and a medical profession, it has got to the point where it's actually embarrassing, I think. The training of psychiatrists, including here in Spain, certainly in America, it's been like this for ages, is actually run by the drug companies. How can a profession allow their training to be dictated by an organization that must have a vested interest in pushing biological explanations and biological solutions? I think it's time that psychiatry established a proper professional ethical boundary between itself and the drug companies. Then they can return to what they used to be, which was a proper scientific discipline, basing their clinical decisions on research rather than ideology and drug company propaganda. And it can return to being the humane, caring, professional organization it once was, which it is no longer at the present. After working for 20 years as a clinical psychologist and managing mental health services, I went back into academia and started looking at the research about this and then conducting my own research into it. And there's no doubt whatsoever, having researched it now for 20 years and seen other researchers around the world also get interested in this field, that childhood trauma, broadly defined, child abuse, child neglect, bullying, extreme bullying at school, a whole list of adversities that happen in childhood are extremely predictive of psychosis and schizophrenia. They're also predictive of depression, anxiety, and drug abuse and everything else. So there's nothing different about schizophrenia, except that psychiatrists keep saying that schizophrenia has got nothing to do with child abuse or childhood trauma. It's a biological illness. It's a genetic illness. And the evidence for that is extremely weak. And most geneticists are now abandoning the search for the schizophrenia gene, having wasted millions of dollars over the last 50 years looking for it, which is a shame. It'd be nice if they'd give us that money back now so we could spend it on something useful, but I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah, one of the reasons why psychiatry has got stuck in this very simplistic, pessimistic medical model, this biological explanation of human distress and craziness, is because they are funded to such a great extent by the pharmaceutical companies. And of course, pharmaceutical companies are not going to be too excited about theories like, this is not a biological illness, this is an understandable reaction to life events. This has got nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with medical science. These are human beings responding to whatever it is, war trauma, being a refugee, rape, trauma, all sorts of things. That psychiatry has made itself in the last 20 years so dependent on the drug companies that actually I would be embarrassed to be a psychiatrist. I think when it comes to treatment, it has to be the choice of the person who is having the experiences. Because medications work for some people, talking therapy works for other people. And that's a big part of what's wrong with our mental health services at the moment. People are not being given choices. People are being told, you must take the medication. And anywhere in the world, if you were to do a survey of, go to any psychiatric hospital anywhere in the world and take the people who have been diagnosed schizophrenic, you will find that between 95 to 98% of them will be given medication within 24 hours, no question. If it was up to me, I would definitely say the talking therapies have much more research evidence to support their effectiveness, and they're much safer. What patients often aren't told is that antipsychotic medication can cause a whole range of serious health conditions. They quickly discover that they often cause weight gain, very serious weight gain, which by itself is fairly stigmatizing. When you're already struggling with issues about yourself and about how your life is going, to suddenly grow like a balloon is not very good for your self-esteem. They have lots of other temporary effects, like they pretty much mess up your sexuality. But more importantly, they have shown to cause diabetes, heart conditions, and there's pretty good evidence now that these drugs reduce people's lifespan by, on average, about 10 years. Now, so I do believe in patient choice, but I also believe that people need to be told all the facts, the pros and cons. So I believe in informed choice. And given the full information, if patients were told all the information that's available, research-based information, I think most wouldn't take the medication. In fact, that's already happening because within 12 months of being prescribed these medications, 50 to 60% of people throw them away because of the side effects, because they don't want to be obese, because they want to be sexual. They don't want to have diabetes. They don't want to have heart conditions. The problem is when people try to stop taking them, then they're told that they have to take them. And in many countries, there are laws that say if you don't take the medication, we will take you back into hospital and make you take the medication. And there's no other branch of medicine where you can do that. So if you look at all the studies that have ever been done on medication, and you have to bear in mind that most of them have been done by drug companies, but if we put that on one side for the moment, we can reasonably say that roughly a third of people receiving antipsychotic medication will gain some sort of benefit from them. That's usually a sort of, the benefit is in the form of being tranquilized, being calmed down. And sometimes there is a role for that. Some of these experiences are very scary, and so being calmed down for a little while is not a bad thing. But 2/3 of people receive no benefit from them at all, and all of the people on them are being exposed to these risks, these health risks. So overall, it's not a very good cost-benefit analysis. Now, the talking therapies have quite good evidence, especially cognitive therapy, not because it's better than psychoanalysis or the other types of therapy, but because the cognitive therapists are better researchers. They go out of their way to demonstrate that what they do works, whereas some of the other branches of other approaches to therapy kind of assume it works and don't do the research, which I don't think is a very good idea. So, but there's very good evidence that cognitive therapy works, which makes sense because cognitive therapy is designed to help people deal with disordered thinking. And it's been mostly used, though, for depression and anxiety. But in the last 10, 15 years, people, especially in Britain, starting in Britain, have been demonstrating that you can help people look at the ideas they're having and check out whether they are actually based in reality or not. And do that respectfully and gently and slowly, which is entirely different from saying, you've got a brain disease, your thinking is completely rubbish, and we're going to stop you doing that. You know, the most important thing about what works is it's not what type of treatment you do, it's how you do it. So the best research, I think, is showing quite clearly that what determines whether somebody gets better is not whether you do cognitive therapy or psychoanalysis or any other form of treatment. It's the quality of the relationship between the two people. That's what determines whether somebody gets better, which is kind of interesting. People develop all sorts of ways to cope with these frightening experiences. But we should say first that if we look at hearing voices, not all the voices that people hear are bad. A lot of people hear voices that are very comforting, very reassuring, and sometimes it's the voices that get people through difficult situations. People who hear voices or have what psychiatrists call delusions are not so different from anybody else. They cope in the same way that we all cope when we're struggling. So we'll all have their different ways of doing it. Some people will use alcohol, some people will use marijuana, just as some people who don't hear voices cope with things in that way. Others will find, what most people say is helpful is finding one or two other people who understand, who will listen without judging. Sometimes for some people it's a belief, can be a religious belief, can be a voice. This is interesting. It can be one of the good voices in the middle of all the bad voices, a good voice that tells you you're okay. Don't listen to those bad voices. You're a good person, you'll be okay. So people find many, many different ways to get through. And one of those is an organization internationally called the Hearing Voices Network. And I think they have now set up in approximately 20 countries. And these are people who hear voices, most of whom have been called schizophrenic or psychotic or whatever, have been in hospital and have been medicated, and have just simply got fed up waiting for decent services. And by decent, I mean services that will listen to them, will respect their experience, not try and throw labels at them, not try and forcibly medicate them. And they're setting up support groups all over the world, and they've organized themselves internationally. And people can find that quite easily by just Googling Hearing Voices. This is one of the most exciting things that happened in all my time in mental health.